Struggling with church hurt? Hey, welcome to The Whole Truth, where I am taking you through the entire Bible, from Genesis to Revelation, and we are not skipping anything. So if that sounds good to you, reach down, hit the little subscribe button below. Don't forget likes, comments, and shares. We'll take the videos far and wide, and it doesn't cost you a thing. But if you'd like to support the channel even more, you can do it over at Patreon. Patreon.com/thewholetruth, and then you can get all of the study notes as well as support the channel financially and help take the Bible to the masses right here on social media. I hope that you'll join me in this endeavor, and I hope that you'll go grab your Bible. That's the biggest thing. What I want you to do is to go grab your Bible and turn it open to 1 Samuel. That's the point of this whole channel, is to get as many as we can to come study the Bible together. I truly believe that the Bible has the answers for our lives, but we've got to get into it and we've got to read it. Now, in 1 Samuel chapter 1, we have the story of how Samuel is born. Samuel is he's going to be the prophet. He's the last judge. He's going to usher in the first king in Israel. And I talked about all of that in the introduction to 1 Samuel. So go back and check that out if you need to. But in 1 Samuel chapter 1, we're actually seeing the story of his mom Hannah. His mom, who has, well, her own issues. She's barren. She doesn't have children. She doesn't have any children. Her husband has another wife, and that wife has children. That was a pretty big deal, especially in that time in the world. To not have a child was a really big deal. And even more than that, that other wife was like tormenting her. This is during the time as the judges are closing out. So Israel's not doing great. It's not really a great place. The priests aren't really good priests. And yet we see Hannah is faithful to God, even though others and other things are not good. You know, there's a lesson that I would just want to throw out from the very beginning as we read this, that we see Hannah dedicated to worshiping God regardless of bad circumstances or bad people. I think there's a lesson that we can learn there. There's a lot of talk today about, I'm going to kind of put this in quotes over here, church hurt. You know, that the church has hurt somebody and therefore that person is never going to go to church again. Can I tell you, if I was to say right now, anybody here watching who's been hurt by the church and then vowed they would never go to church again, would you raise your hand? You ready? That's right. I did that. When I was 18 years old, I did that same thing. The church that I was attending, I wanted to get married, and I knew God had called me to get married. The church refused to do the wedding and forbid me from using the facility or helping in any way, and would not support the marriage. I ended up eloping. I had a great marriage, by the way. My wife it was a lovely marriage, and that marriage lasted 18 years until my wife passed away. And the Lord used us for a lot of wonderful things. And so it was a really special marriage. And it would have never happened if in that way, it would have happened, but it would have never happened the way that it did. There's parts of the story that wouldn't have happened the way they happened if I didn't experience the things I experienced. But when I was 18 years old, I didn't know that I was going to experience those things. And when the church refused to do the wedding and the church refused to support in any way, and it was tragic in the moment. Like it was such a hard thing, and I didn't understand it. And I got so mad. I said, the church is a country club. That's what I used to say. I would say the church is a country club for whoever can pay their dues and tithe. And so I vowed that I would never go back. That's what I said. I didn't vow. I didn't like take an actual vow, but I said, I will never go to church again. And I just had the view that I was going to go be a missionary, or that I was going to go be an evangelist. And I was going to tell people about Jesus, but I wasn't going to do it through the church, because the church was for hypocrites, and it was a country club. And you know what? There probably are. That's probably not an entirely incorrect statement, that churches are probably country clubs at times. And there probably are churches that have bad leaders, and there probably are churches that do wrong. And you maybe have attended one of those. That maybe all of that is true. Should we let some experience that we've had block us from corporate worship and block us from being a part of God's people? And I don't believe the answer to that is yes. Especially not in today's world. We're about to read a story where this woman had one option to go. That was the tabernacle. But you probably live in a part of the world where there's probably several options for you to choose from to go to church. You're probably not limited to only one. And that's not even to mention the fact that sometimes we let tragedy get in the way, and it's not even church that we point the finger at, but it's actually God. All right, that's enough of the introduction. Let's get into it. Let's read it together. Study through 1 Samuel chapter 1. You ready? Let's do the first 10 verses. And now there was a certain man of Ramathaim, Zophim, of the mountains of Ephraim, and his name was Elkanah, the son of Jeroham, the son of Elihu, the son of Tohu, the son of Zuph, an Ephraimite. And he had 2 wives. The name of the one was Hannah, and the name of the other Peninnah. Peninnah had children, but Hannah had no children. This man went up from his city yearly to worship and sacrifice to the Lord of hosts in Shiloh. Also the 2 sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, the priest of the Lord, were there. And whenever the time came for Elkanah to make an offering, he would give portions to Peninnah his wife and to all her sons and daughters. But to Hannah he would give a double portion, for he loved Hannah. And although the Lord had closed her womb, and her rival also provoked her severely to make her miserable because the Lord had closed her womb. And so it was, year by year, when she went up to the house of the Lord, that she provoked her, and therefore she wept and did not eat. Then Elkanah, her husband, said to her, Hannah, why do you weep? Why do you not eat? And why is your heart grieved? Am I not better to you than 10 sons? And so Hannah arose after they had finished eating and drinking in Shiloh. And now Eli the priest was sitting on the seat by the doorpost of the tabernacle of the Lord. And she was in bitterness of soul and prayed to the Lord and wept in anguish. And then she made a vow and said, O Lord of hosts, if you will indeed look on the affliction of your maidservant and remember me and not forget your maidservant, will give your maidservant a male child, then I will give him to the Lord all the days of his life, and no razor shall come upon his head. So we see the story opens with a guy named Elkanah who has 2 wives, Hannah and Peninnah. Hannah and Peninnah are sister wives. Now, I just want to address this really quickly because I know that there might be some who read that and go, see, the Bible promotes polygamy. No, the Bible does not promote polygamy. What we see through the Bible is that whenever there's polygamy, there's always strife and turmoil. You know, another time there was polygamy in the Bible? Abraham. Abraham had a second wife. He took his wife's handmaid, Hagar, and had a child with her. And you know what happened? Strife and conflict. Do you know that God told Solomon, if you go, well, Solomon had a ton of wives. Yeah, God told him not to do that. And do you know, as Solomon writes the book of Ecclesiastes, it's like life is worthless. You know, everything's terrible. And the only thing good is to worship God and give yourself to him, because everything else is going to the same place. Everything else is going to end in destruction, and everything else has an end. That's the book of Ecclesiastes. Did you know when you get in the book of Ecclesiastes, you know what he concludes with? Love the wife of your youth. I'm one of those who believes that the Song of Solomon that we read, the Song of Songs or Song of Solomon, which I'm getting ready to teach through, I believe that love letter is to his first wife, the one that he really fell in love with. And then all those others were for political gain or lust of the flesh or whatever was happening there. But it wasn't God telling him to do that. Elkanah had 2 wives, and the Bible is unique in that the people in the Bible who are good guys, if you will, they're not painted as perfect. We see their flaws in the text. Here's this guy who has 2 wives, and it's causing strife and conflict because Hannah, he loves her, but she doesn't have children. Peninnah does have children. And so the story goes that we're reading here that they would go up to worship. And every time they would go up to worship, he would give a portion to to Peninnah and to her children. So a portion meaning when they would go up to make sacrifices, they would sacrifice an animal like a bull. They would take the meat of that bull. Some of it would get completely burned up. Some of it was completely for the Lord. Other parts of it would get divided up for the family to eat together. They didn't waste it. It's not like they just killed the bull for nothing. They would eat the meat that had been sacrificed to God. And all those sacrifices point forward to Christ, and they speak of forgiveness and redemption and reconciliation, and all of that is in the book of Leviticus, and I've got videos on all of those. But for now, understand they go and make these sacrifices, and some of the meat is divided up to the family. Elkanah would give the portion to Peninnah and to the children that he had with Peninnah, but he would always give a double portion to Hannah. He was demonstrating to her in the best way that he could that he loved her, even though she didn't have children. He even told her that he loved her. But notice that every time that they would go up and she's getting this double blessing, you almost get this picture. It doesn't say this explicitly, but you almost get this picture that Peninnah, her jealousy kicks in. Even though she has the children, her jealousy seems to kick in because she is tormenting Hannah because Hannah, her womb is closed. The Lord has not opened her womb. Now, there's several things that I would like to point out, but the first one being, it's that even though Peninnah is tormenting her because of her barrenness, we don't see Hannah not go to worship. Hannah doesn't say, well, I'm not going to go up and worship with you and the family because Peninnah always gives me trouble. She doesn't even say, I'm not going to go up to worship because the Lord has left me barren. She goes up to worship even though she's barren and she doesn't have children. So let's just start with that, with the barrenness portion of that. Did Hannah allow her barrenness, her personal tragedy, to stop the worship of God? Even more, did she let it lead her to a place where she says, well, God must not be real? You know, you don't read anywhere in this story where God has done anything miraculous for Hannah or Elkanah or Peninnah, or maybe Hannah did see some of those miraculous things that God did through the judges. I think there's this I don't know. I think there's this kind of like misconception. I don't think it's actually a misconception. I just think we kind of have this impression that because somebody was during the biblical times that they saw God do something great, so they should believe in God. That's not true. There was lots of time periods that God was not speaking, not moving, not doing some miraculous thing, and yet people were supposed to depend on him by faith and faith alone. You see, you're reading the Bible miracles and God's miracles there. You're reading them in rapid fire succession. So you're like, but he parted the Red Sea and he gave him water from the rock and he did this and he did that. Yeah, for Hannah, that was hundreds of years earlier. I mean, that would be like us referencing something from, I'm right now in, 2025. Could you imagine me referencing something from the 1500s and going, don't you have faith because of what happened in the 1500s? You see what I'm saying? Like, it was hundreds of years before Hannah that God had parted the Red Sea. So no, she's not witnessed God's, at least that we know of, she's not witnessed God's hand move in that way. So she could just as easily as you today might say, well, there is no God because fill in the blank. I hear this all the time. How could there be a loving God? How could there be a God if these things happen in the world? How could God, if there is a God, how could he let me go through what I've gone through? Friends, I could give that same testimony. I told you about my wife, my late wife. I lost her in 2021. I speak to lots of widows and widowers all the time. There's a special connection, between those who've lost someone like that. There's a loss there that's hard for others to understand, but widows and widowers understand each other. But I speak to lots of widows and widowers who have turned their back on God because of their widowhood. They've let the fact that they've lost their spouse and they say, well, God could have controlled that. God could have healed them. God could have stopped that thing. And that's true. God could have, but God has a plan. Do you trust God that he actually does know you? If he really is God of the universe, God says he knows the very number of hairs on your head. He doesn't just know you. He knows how many hairs are on your head. Well, guess what? That means he knows how many dollars are in your bank account. He knows how many shirts are in your drawer. He knows how many jeans are hanging in your closet. He knows the number of hairs on your head. He knows the amount of gas that's in your tank. He knows the food that's in your refrigerator. He knows you. Do you trust that? Do you trust that he sees your tragedy? Do you trust that he weeps with you? Do you trust that he sits by your side? Do you trust that he'll carry you? That's the whole point. So you see that here's this woman, Hannah, she's barren. She goes, every time she goes to the Lord's house, Peninnah's tormenting her and mocking her. And yet where does she go? To the Lord and prays to God. And she makes this vow and says, Lord, if you will give me a child, I will dedicate him to you, even to the point of a Nazirite vow. She references a Nazirite vow here, though it's not, not expressly said. She didn't say, I'll keep him from wine and I'll never let him touch something dead. She says, no razor will come upon his head. That's part of the Nazirite vow. We only see a few people who have the Nazirite vow for their whole lives. And it seems as if maybe Samuel is one of them. That was something that I caught when I read this, that she promised that no razor would come upon his head. So here is Samuel that she is dedicating him before he's ever even born. She doesn't even know of him yet. She's barren at this point. And we also see this kind of typological scenario here again, where it's a miraculous birth. Here's a woman who can't give birth. She can't have a child, but she has dedicated this child. She says, Lord, if you'll give me a child, I will dedicate him to you. No razor will come upon his head, and he'll do the work. She'll dedicate him like a Levite. She'll dedicate him to the work of the Lord. You can't just dedicate anybody to be a priest. They have to be in the line of Aaron, and they have to be a Levite. You might say, well, yeah, but Elkanah said he was an Ephraimite. That's true. It did say that, but there was a place in Ephraim for the Levites to dwell, and that's who Elkanah was, and therefore that's who Samuel was. So he was in the right lineage. He was in the right lineage to be a priest. And she says, I'll dedicate this child to you for his whole life. What a picture of dedication that she's giving. What a picture of trust that she's giving to the Lord. Now, there's another one that's happening too. I want to point out not just her barrenness, but I also want to point out this situation with Peninnah. How many times do we allow someone else's bad actions, someone else has done something or could do something or did something to somebody that we know, and they go to church? This is the practical application side that I see from this. Hannah could have looked at Elkanah and said, I don't want to go to the tabernacle this year because Peninnah always does fill in the blank. And maybe she did. Maybe Hannah and Elkanah had that argument and we don't see that in the scriptures, but maybe they had that. But the portion that we see is that she continued to go up to the tabernacle. Now, even to the point of Peninnah is causing her to weep. Now you say, Justin, are you saying that I shouldn't, set up healthy boundaries? No, I'm not saying that. I'm not saying you shouldn't set up healthy boundaries. I'm telling you this. I deal with people all day long who say, I haven't been to church in fill in the blank amount of years. I'm talking sometimes to the point of decades. I haven't been to church in 20 years or 25 years because when I used to go to church, brother so-and-so used to say such and such to me and my sister, and it really offended us. By the way, none of this is me saying that you should put yourself in a dangerous situation. That is not what I am in any way saying. So please don't say that I am. I'm telling you that people are offended by someone else, by someone else's actions, and they let that lead them away from fellowship with the Lord, where they're 25 years later and they haven't been to church in 25 years. And they've drifted because they haven't been around God's people. They haven't been around God's word in a corporate setting. They haven't been a part of corporate worship because somebody said something, because somebody did something that offended them. And remember, I'm speaking as somebody who was in that scenario. I'm speaking as somebody who was in that place. And so I experienced that church hurt, and I let it lead me to a place. I went my first year of marriage. I eloped with my wife, went to the courthouse and just said, we literally called them up, said, when do you do weddings? They said, we do them on, I think it was Thursdays. We were like, okay, great. We'll be there Thursday. I asked my manager if I could have off a few days from work, and I went to the courthouse and got married. And, there was a few people came, like some family did end up coming to that, but it was just a really, really, really hard time for me in my life. That was hard for me and it wasn't just hard in the sense of that. I mean, it was good in the sense of I'd been married and I was happy to be married and all of those things, but it was hard in the sense of I felt like I didn't just feel like it. I had been burned by my church family, my church friends. And so that part of it was extremely hurtful. And I wasn't really sure how to deal with it. And so what did I do? I'm never going back to church. They're just a country club, right? Like that's what I was saying. And so I've been in those shoes. Look at Hannah's example. Even though Peninnah is tormenting her, she doesn't let that keep her from God's tabernacle, from worship of God. She continued in what God wanted from her, even though it was not easy. Now, there's something else I want to point out as well, and that's the corrupt leadership. Let's read a little further. I want to read up to verse 18, and then I want to talk about this leadership for a moment. So up to verse 18, I'm going to pick up in verse 12 now. And it happened as she continued praying before the Lord that Eli watched her mouth. And now Hannah spoke in her heart, only her lips moved, but her voice was not heard. And therefore Eli thought she was drunk. So Eli said to her, "How long will you be drunk? Put your wine away from you." But Hannah answered and said, "No, my Lord, I am a woman of sorrowful spirit. I have not drunk neither wine nor intoxicating drink, but I have poured out my soul before the Lord. Do not consider your maidservant a wicked woman, for out of the abundance of my complaint and grief I have spoken until now." And then Eli answered and said, "Go in peace, and the God of Israel grant your petition which you have asked of him." And she said, "Let your maidservant find favor in your sight." And so the woman went away and ate, and her face was no longer sad. Okay, so Hannah goes to this place of worship called the tabernacle. And I, again, don't have time to go into all of that. I've got other videos about the tabernacle. But it was a place of worship in the Old Testament. It was the place of worship in the Old Testament. The priests were there, and this is where people would go to commune with God, to have fellowship with God, was at the tabernacle. Different types of services than what we would know as church services, but nonetheless, it was the place for people to go. She goes there to this place of worship, and she's praying, and it was very clear that she was praying in her heart, only her mouth was moving. She wasn't using words like I'm using right now. Her mouth was moving, it more like this. So she's doing this type of a thing where she's moving her mouth, but her prayer is in her heart. By the way, I almost made this whole Bible study today about prayer and the answer to prayer. If you're wondering, I heard a pastor one time say, speak out your prayer so the Lord can hear it. I'm all about speaking. I believe there's power in our words. Like the Lord has told us that. I think there's power in that, and you should speak your prayers. However, you can pray in your heart, and the Lord hears. And so here's Hannah, and she's praying in her heart. Her mouth is moving. Eli thinks she's drunk. Eli, the priest, who has his two sons, Hophni and Phinehas, who we'll talk about in the next chapter, they are some wicked priests. They are not good. They are, in order, let me tell you this, they are robbing from the people. They're robbing from them, meaning their sacrifices. The things that the people were bringing to dedicate to the Lord or to sacrifice to the Lord, Hophni and Phinehas were stealing from that. And they had like methods of doing it. One of them was to take like a big hook, and they would stick it in. When the meat was boiling, they would stick the hook in and they would pull it out. And whatever came out on the hook, they believed was supposed to be their portion, instead of leaving it for the Lord like they were supposed to, or dividing it up between the family like they were supposed to. And by the way, the Bible does also tell us that they're fat. And it's because they like overeat on all the stuff that's being sacrificed. And so they're awful in that way. They're sleeping with women at the door of the tabernacle. Like when the women come to the gate, they're lying with the women at the gate of the tabernacle. It is not good leadership. Hey, can you hear this too? Oh, listen. Her barrenness didn't stop her from coming to the Lord. Peninnah didn't stop her from coming to the Lord. The wicked leadership didn't stop her from coming to the Lord. Let that sink in for a moment. I know that bad leadership in a church, and I am not telling you that you don't have a right to leave a church because of bad leadership. If you need to leave a church because of bad leadership, then go ahead and leave the church. But please hear this. You need to find a church that doesn't have bad leadership. And if you say to me, I've tried every church in our area, I've gone to every single one, and they all have bad leadership. They're all full of Hophnies and Phinehas's. This church is stealing money, and this church is, full of adultery and whatever. And this church doesn't have good doctrine. They're doing LGBTQ stuff. And you can give me all those and say all of them. Then you know what? Maybe God's calling you to be the one to start a church. I heard of a church recently that started, and the person that started the church wasn't a pastor, wasn't a teacher, wasn't a deacon, and wasn't an elder. They just wanted a church so bad that they started seeking out others who wanted a Bible study, wanted a church, and they began to meet in their home. They opened up their home as a place of meeting, and over time, the Lord brought them a pastor, brought them teachers, and now they have a flourishing church from what started from somebody basically saying, we want a good church, we're hungry for a good church, and there's got to be other people that are hungry for the same thing. Listen, Hophni and Phinehas and Eli were not good leaders. They were not good priests. They weren't even good men. And yet Hannah went and prayed to the Lord. And even when Eli accused her of being drunk, I just guarantee you, as a pastor, I can guarantee you this. If I looked at somebody, saw them praying with their mouth moving, and I was like, you drunk? How long will you tarry at the wine? Put it away from you. They'd be, do you realize how mad somebody would be at me if I said that to them? Oh my goodness, they would, blast it all over Facebook. Oh, Pastor Justin accused me of being drunk when I was praying. But instead, Hannah says, no, my Lord, no, it's not that. I'm not drunk. I'm of a sorrowful heart, and I'm pouring out my spirit to the Lord because I'm grieving. I want a child, and I'm barren. And then when Eli realizes that, he offers her a blessing. And in the blessing, even though he is a wicked leader, he offers her a blessing, and she receives that blessing. And it says that her countenance changes and she goes away. She trusted in that blessing. Was it because of the character that Eli was of such good character? No, she trusts that God had put the right priest, or put the priest in place, and that God was going to answer his blessing and his anointing that he gave her. So he blesses her and says, be blessed. You're going to be good. The Lord's going to give you a child. And she trusted him. Let's read up the rest of the chapter and see what happens next. And then they arose early in the morning, verse 19, by the way. They arose early in the morning and worshiped before the Lord, and returned and came to their house at Ramah. And Elkanah knew Hannah his wife, and the Lord remembered her. And so it came to pass in the process of time that Hannah conceived and bore a son, and called his name Samuel, saying, because I have asked for him from the Lord. And now the man Elkanah and all his house went up to offer to the Lord yearly sacrifices and his vow. But Hannah did not go up, for she said to her husband, not until the child is weaned, and then I will take him, that he may appear before the Lord and remain there forever. And so Elkanah, her husband, said to her, do what seems best to you. Wait until you've weaned him. Only let the Lord establish his word. And then the woman stayed and nursed her son until she had weaned him. And now when she had weaned him, she took him up with her with 3 bulls, 1 ephah of flour, and a skin of wine, and brought him to the house of the Lord in Shiloh. And the child was young. And then they slaughtered the bull and brought the child to Eli. And she said, "O my Lord, as your soul lives, my Lord, I am the woman who stood by you here praying to the Lord for this child. I prayed, and the Lord has granted me my petition, which I ask of him. Therefore, I have also lent him to the Lord as long as he lives. He shall be lent to the Lord." And so they worshiped the Lord there. So Hannah asked the Lord, was petitioning the Lord. She made that vow. Eli, the priest, said, "You'll be blessed." She goes home from worship. Her face changed. She went home from worship, and she laid with her husband, and she became pregnant, and she conceived. She had the child, and the first year comes around. She's got this infant little baby, and he's still nursing. And she says, I don't want to go with you this year because I've dedicated this child to the Lord. I don't want to go with you this year because he's still nursing. He can't eat if he goes, Eli and Hophni and Phinehas can't feed the child. I don't want the child. I'm not giving him to die. I'm giving him to the service of the Lord. And so she says, after he's weaned, I'll take him up. And Elkanah says, do what seems best to you. Just let the Lord be established. In other words, what he's saying is this: don't go back on what you've said. You told the Lord that you would dedicate this child to the Lord. You have to dedicate this child to the Lord. That's what he's saying. And she agrees to that. So she waits for a few years until the child is weaned. So he's probably at this point 3 or 4 years old, maybe even as old as 5. So he's 3 or 4 years old. He's weaned. He's not nursing anymore. And she takes, can you imagine? Here she is taking her toddler to go to the tabernacle. And she's going to leave him to serve the Lord at the tabernacle for his whole life. Now, she's going to come and visit him. It's actually a sweet little story of how she comes and visits him. And you might be like, oh, my goodness, who could do that to their child? Hold on. God uses this. This is the beginning of Samuel. This is the man. Well, he's a baby right now. He's a little baby, but he will hear the voice of God, and he will be the mouthpiece of God for the nation. But did you know that Hannah didn't know that? She just knew that she dedicated him to the Lord. She doesn't exactly know how this whole thing is going to end up. She does. I have the view of hindsight. I can go look backward and say, look at all what Samuel does. She didn't know that when he was 3 or 4 years old. She saw her 3 or 4-year-old little boy who was tugging around little toy wagons. She saw her 3 or 4-year-old little boy who was digging in the dirt and making mountains and volcanoes. That's who she saw. And yet she had made a vow to dedicate that child to the Lord. And that's what she did. She fulfilled that vow even though she didn't exactly know what was next. Friends, can I ask you this? Is there something in your life that you feel God calling you to do? Some part of worship that you call God to, that there's an uncertainty to that? Don't let uncertainty be the reason that you don't serve the Lord. Whether it's tragedy or hardship or trial in your life, whether it's other people, whether it's leadership, or even if it's to the point of the thing that you're unsure about, would you follow the Lord and trust him that he is sovereign over all things, that he really is our good Father, and he really will use you, use your scenario, use your story. He will use you, and he can accomplish great things through even people like us if we will trust him. And I think Hannah's story in 1 Samuel chapter 1 is a picture of that. Have you trusted in the Lord that he really will take care of you, that he knows you and he knows your situation? Do you trust him right now? If you haven't, you can do that. You can put your faith in the Lord even right now by trusting in his son, Jesus Christ. God sent his only son, just like we see here that Hannah is giving her only son at the time to dedicate it to the Lord's work. Did you know that the Bible says, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son, that whosoever believes in him would not perish, but have everlasting life. God loved us so much that he gave us his son. And if you'll put your faith in his son, Jesus, who lived a perfect life and died a sinner's death, was buried in a tomb and rose from the grave 3 days later, if you'll put your faith in him, God says that he'll save you. And I hope that you've put your trust in him today. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this study through 1 Samuel chapter 1, and I hope you'll come back tomorrow for 1 Samuel chapter 2. See you then.